Welcome to the Mystery and Horror Channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. Grandma's Mirror. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited her mirror. It was an old piece, dark wooden frame with carved details that, according to her, had been in the family for generations. I remember that as a child, I had a mix of fascination and fear for that mirror. The surface was slightly foggy, as if the reflections held more than what was visible. Even so, when I brought it to my house, I thought it would just be a decorative item with sentimental value. The first week, everything was normal, but as days passed, something started bothering me. Every time I walked by the hallway where the mirror was, I felt an inexplicable chill, something that seemed to come from within me. I'd look at my reflection and feel like my eyes looked different. It was as if a shadow occupied the depths of my gaze, something I couldn't quite identify. I thought it was just the longing for my grandmother, so I decided to ignore the feeling. But what happened the following night was impossible to ignore. I was asleep and woke up in the middle of the night with an irresistible urge to go to the mirror. Without understanding why, I got up and went, almost as if being pulled by something invisible. When I got to the mirror, the hallway was dark, but there was a slight light coming from somewhere. I looked at my reflection and suddenly, my own face was staring back with an expression I didn't recognize, cold, almost angry. I blinked, and for a second it seemed like the reflection took just a little longer to blink, as if it was moving on its own. A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep again. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing until dawn. In the following days, the feeling only got worse. Every time I passed by the mirror, I felt a heaviness in the air, a dense silence, as if the mirror was watching me too. I started avoiding that hallway, but every time I had to pass by it, I couldn't resist looking. And each time, I saw my reflection with that same strange look. The situation reached its peak one night when I woke up again, but this time with a noise that seemed to come from the hallway. It was a scratching sound, soft and continuous, that seemed directly connected to the mirror. Trembling, I got up and went to the hallway. As I approached the mirror, the noise stopped, and the hallway plunged into an absolute silence. I placed my hand on the frame and felt an almost piercing cold, but I couldn't pull away. That's when I saw it. My reflection was smiling, but I wasn't smiling. My face, on the other side, curled its lips into a smile that wasn't mine. A cold, cruel smile that seemed to mock my fear. I froze, not knowing what to do, as the reflection raised its hand, mimicking the movement I had made before. But instead of touching the frame, it pressed its hand against the glass as if trying to break through. At that moment, every part of me screamed to get out of there, but I couldn't move. That smile held me as if it had some kind of power over me. I only managed to pull away when I felt a warmth rise through my body, as if someone was pulling me away. I ran to my room and locked the door, my heart pounding. After that, I couldn't look at the mirror anymore. The next day, I covered the mirror with a sheet and left it in the attic. Since then, I sometimes still hear the same scratching sound, as if something or someone is trying to get out of there. Story 2. The Voice in the Well. I always knew there was something strange about that house. It was my grandparents' home, a place where I spent much of my childhood, but it always carried a dark and silent air. There was something particularly unsettling in the backyard, an old well made of worn stones and moss, hidden between the trees. My grandparents never let me get close. They'd say it was dangerous, that the well was old, without a cover, and that I could hurt myself, but deep down, I felt there was more they didn't want to tell me. Years later, after they passed away, the house was left to me. Returning there brought a mix of nostalgia and melancholy, and I knew I needed to sort through the house to put an end to the memories it held. For the first few weeks, nothing happened, and I even began to think that my childhood fears were just imagination. But then, one night, while trying to sleep, I heard something strange coming from outside. It was a low sound, almost a whisper, and even with the windows closed, it was clear enough to catch my attention. I ignored the sound, thinking it was just the wind, and lay back down. But when the sound repeated, clearer and longer, I realized it was coming from the backyard. my heart started beating faster, and a feeling of déjà vu washed over me. Something inside me told me not to go out, to leave that mystery alone. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight, put on a jacket, and went to the backyard, trying to ignore the chill crawling up my spine. As I approached the well, the sound became clearer. It was a hoarse, dragged voice, whispering words I couldn't understand. I got closer, my heart pounding so hard I could almost hear it. The flashlight lit up the moss-covered stones, and a damp, sickening smell rose from the well's depths. I looked down, hoping to see nothing but darkness. But in that instant I heard my name. A low voice like a lament calling me. I jumped back, my heart racing, but I couldn't take my eyes off the dark bottom of the well. In the following days, the voice continued. Every night, like clockwork, I'd hear that same voice calling me, whispering words I couldn't decipher. I started losing sleep, and the tired face I saw in the mirror seemed to carry the same desperation the voice conveyed. Then one night, I decided to confront whatever was down there. I grabbed a rope, tied it to one of the nearby trees, and slowly descended, trying to ignore the growing panic in my chest. With each meter I went down, the darkness seemed to swallow me, and the air became colder and denser, almost impossible to breathe. When I finally reached the bottom, I realized I wasn't alone. In a small hollow among the stones, there was a figure. It was only a shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, eyes that reflected nothing but emptiness. I tried to climb back up, but my arms shook so much it was hard to hold onto the rope. The voice whispered louder, as if now it was inside my head, and I felt as if I'd be trapped in that well forever. I managed to escape with a strength I didn't know I had, and since then I've never been the same. Today the house stands abandoned, and the well has been covered with stones and concrete. But on windy nights, I still hear that whisper, as if the voice is trying to escape, calling me, waiting for me to return to the place where it found me. Story 3. The Shadow in the Mirror. It all started when I moved into my new apartment. It was a small, modest place, but it had everything I needed. One of the items I decided to bring along was a full-length mirror, a gift from my mother. It was an old mirror with a dark wooden frame and intricate carvings, something I always thought was beautiful and had a vintage charm. On the first night in the new apartment, I settled in as best as I could and went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and the first thing my eyes landed on was the mirror. It was mounted on the wall across from my bed, reflecting my body stretched out in the dim light of the room. But there was something strange there, a shadow that looked out of place. It was a vague silhouette, yet it seemed wrong. I stared at it, trying to understand what it was, but the image seemed to blur when I tried to focus. I thought it was just the effect of darkness and fatigue, so I went back to sleep. In the following days, I began to notice strange things around the mirror. Sometimes I'd walk past the hallway and get the impression that there was something moving inside it, as if my reflection wasn't the only thing it showed. I started feeling uneasy, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I tried convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. Then one night things got worse. I woke up again without any reason and saw my reflection in the mirror, but something was wrong. I was lying in bed, motionless, yet the reflection seemed to be moving subtly, as if it were breathing differently from me. I looked hard at the mirror, feeling a chill climb up my spine. Myself in the reflection was smiling faintly, a smile I knew wasn't mine, and its eyes were staring at me with an unsettling intensity. Out of fear, I got up and turned the mirror to face the wall, determined to get rid of it. But the feeling didn't go away. The next day, the mirror was back in its original position. I was sure no one else had entered my apartment, so it didn't make sense. I felt a cold sweat drip down my face as I tried to understand what was happening. That night, everything changed. I woke up again with a feeling that something was very, very wrong. I looked at the mirror, and this time the figure I saw wasn't me. It was something similar, but there was a shadow where the eyes should be, and a smile that seemed to mock my fear. The reflection moved, raising its hand as if it wanted to cross through the glass, as if it wanted to get out. I was paralyzed, unable to react, until the room became completely cold and a low, almost whispered voice called my name. The next morning, I took the mirror out of the apartment and left it in the building's storage area. But even now, I feel like it's still nearby, as if something stayed with me. No matter where I go, I feel like if I look into a mirror, I'll see it watching me, waiting for another chance to come through. Story 4. The basement room. I've always been afraid of the basement in my parents' house. Ever since I was a child, the idea of that dark, damp space beneath our feet, so close yet so isolated from the rest of the house, made me uneasy. My parents always said it was just a childish fear that I would grow out of it, but as I got older, the discomfort only grew. The basement was cold, damp, and often had a strange smell, like a mix of earth and something sour, almost metallic. When I turned 18, my parents decided to go on a week-long trip, leaving me in charge of the house. It seemed like a good opportunity to overcome my fear of the basement, so I forced myself to go down there to organize some old boxes my parents had been telling me to sort. The basement had a heavy atmosphere, and as soon as I descended, I felt the air grow denser, almost suffocating. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the feeling of claustrophobia, and began sifting through the boxes. While I rummaged through old belongings, I noticed a small door in the corner of the basement that I had never seen before. It was so inconspicuous, half covered by a stack of boxes, that it went completely unnoticed. It was a tiny door made of worn wood with a rusty lock. It seemed strange. I thought I knew the house well, or at least I thought I did, and had never noticed that door. Curiosity got the better of me, and against my better judgment, I decided to open it. As I turned the handle, a strong musty smell escaped, like air that had been trapped for decades. Inside was a tiny room with bare concrete walls and a small wooden chair in the center, facing the wall. There was something deeply unsettling about that scene. The air was cold and thick, and for some reason the sight of that empty chair in that position felt profoundly wrong. I felt an odd urge to sit in the chair, as if something was drawing me into the room, but I resisted. The sensation of being watched intensified, and the silence in the basement became almost unbearable. Suddenly, a low, raspy voice echoed in the room, calling my name. I froze. The sound seemed to come from all directions, reverberating off the concrete walls, as if it were trapped there with me. Trembling, I backed away, but before I could run, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing there, only the cold silence in the chair, now turned to face me. The door closed by itself with a loud click, and I was trapped in the room for a few seconds that felt like hours, feeling panic set in. When the door finally opened, I ran out and slammed it shut, stacking boxes in front of it. Since then, I've never gone back to the basement. I told my parents, but they laughed, saying I was imagining things. But I know what I saw and heard. That door, that room, that chair, all of them hold something I would rather never face again. Story 5. The Midnight Passenger. I never thought that something as simple as a late-night ride could turn into a nightmare. I work as a rideshare driver, often taking trips late into the night. On one of those nights, I received a request around 3 a.m. from an isolated spot at the edge of town, near a wooded area. It was an unusual location, somewhere I rarely picked up passengers. When I arrived, I waited for a few minutes. The app showed that the passenger was already there, but I didn't see anyone around. I double-checked the address, sighed, and was about to leave when I saw someone emerging from the shadows by the side of the road. It was a tall man wearing a long black coat that hid most of his face. He got in without a word, only nodding toward the road, silently indicating for me to start the ride. Feeling uneasy, I didn't question him. I started the car and drove in silence. The man kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, unmoving, and the silence was thick, almost oppressive. Every now and then, I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but his face remained hidden in shadow, his hood pulled low over his eyes. A few minutes in, I noticed his lips moving, but there was no sound. It looked like he was murmuring to himself, though I couldn't make out any words. I felt a chill run through me, and the air in the car felt cold, colder than it should have been. When I looked in the mirror again, I almost swerved off the road. For a brief moment, his face looked wrong, inhuman. His eyes were sunken and empty, almost as if they were staring through me. Fear gripped me, and I wanted to abandon the ride and get out of the car, but I forced myself to keep driving, trying to calm my racing heart. Finally, the app indicated that we'd reached the destination, a deserted road with no houses in sight. He gestured to a spot up ahead, mumbling that we had arrived. When I stopped the car, he leaned forward, and for the first time I saw his face clearly. It was pale, his eyes hollow, his expression cold and emotionless. Then he leaned closer and whispered something that chilled me to the core. "Thank you for bringing me back." Before I could respond, he opened the door and stepped out. I watched as he faded into the mist that had crept over the road, disappearing completely from sight. I sat frozen, unsure of what had just happened. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was just a strange passenger, but those words kept echoing in my mind. Since that night, I avoid taking rides at that hour. I still don't know who or what that passenger was, but every time I drive past that wooded area, I feel an eerie chill, as though he's still there, waiting for someone to take him back again. Story 6. The Child in the Park. I was never one to believe in ghost stories. I always thought they were tales invented to scare people, especially kids. But after what happened to me in the park, I began to question that certainty. I work as a night security guard at a local park, and the job is usually quiet. Most of the time, all I need to do is monitor the cameras and take a few rounds to make sure no one has entered after closing hours. That night, everything was quiet as usual. The early hours were cold, and a light mist had started to form, giving the park an almost eerie look. I walked along with my flashlight, moving along the main path between trees and benches. But then I saw something that didn't make sense. A child right in the middle of the park, sitting on one of the swings. She was turned away from me, swaying slowly back and forth, in a nearly hypnotic motion. I froze for a moment, trying to understand what a child could be doing there, alone at that hour. I walked closer and called out, but she didn't respond. My voice echoed in the silence, but nothing changed. She continued swinging at the same steady pace. As I got closer, I could see she was wearing a white dress, dirty with mud. Her hair was loose, covering part of her face. Something about the scene deeply disturbed me. I felt a chill but tried to ignore the discomfort and asked her where her parents were, trying to sound friendly. No response. She just kept swinging as if I wasn't there. Finally, I decided to shine my flashlight on her face, hoping to get a better look. When the light hit her, my blood went cold. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, staring at me with an empty, lifeless gaze. I took a step back, trying to understand what I was seeing, but couldn't bring myself to move. Then she stopped swinging and, without looking away, tilted her head slightly as if she were studying me. My breathing caught in my chest. I felt an inexplicable fear, an overwhelming urge to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. Suddenly, she stood up from the swing and began to walk towards me, slowly, dragging her feet through the park's gravel. I turned and ran without looking back. My breaths came in gasps, and my heart felt like it was about to explode. When I finally reached the guard station, I locked the door and collapsed in the chair, still trembling. I checked the cameras, and the park looked empty, as if nothing had happened. The child was gone. The next day, when I told a coworker about what happened, he turned pale and told me an old story about a girl who had disappeared in the park decades ago. Since then, many have reported seeing a child alone on the swing set on misty nights. Now, every time the mist starts to form, I feel a chill and avoid going near the playground. Story 7. The Painting in the Living Room. I've always been fascinated by antiques, especially objects that seem to have a story to tell. So when I visited a flea market in a small town, I found something that immediately caught my attention. It was a large painting, framed in dark, sturdy wood, carved with intricate details that seemed almost alive. The painting depicted a woman with a somber expression, her gaze deep and penetrating, following anyone who walked by. The seller told me the painting had belonged to an old mansion, abandoned years ago. Without hesitation, I bought it, thinking it would be an interesting piece for my living room. On the first night, I felt something strange. Even before I hung it up, the atmosphere in the living room felt heavier. I put the painting on the wall and spent the evening trying to get used to the figure staring back at me. Her gaze was intense, almost disturbing. But I thought it was just fatigue, and eventually I went to bed. In the middle of the night, however, I woke up with an odd feeling as if someone were watching me. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow passing down the hall. I chalked it up to a trick of light, maybe from the painting itself, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I went to the living room, and there it was, exactly where I'd left it. But something felt different. The woman's eyes seemed even more alive, almost glowing, as if she were watching me with a look of disdain. I returned to my room, trying to push the thoughts away, but I couldn't sleep. The next day, I noticed the painting was slightly tilted, as if someone had touched it. I adjusted it and went about my day, but each time I passed by, I felt her gaze more intently, and the air around the painting seemed to grow colder. That night, I was jolted awake by a faint noise, like something scratching against the wall. I went to the living room, and the painting was lying on the floor. It didn't make sense. I had secured it well, and there was no reason for it to fall. I began to feel uneasy and thought about getting rid of it, but something in me seemed tied to it, as if I couldn't simply let it go. Over the following days, strange things started happening. Objects moved around, shadows appeared in the corners, and the painting seemed to shift slightly, with the woman's expression growing more and more displeased. One night, I decided to face it, to try to understand what was happening. I stood in front of it, staring back at the woman's face, almost as if waiting for some response. And in that moment, I felt something cold brush against my shoulder, like an icy hand touching my skin. I froze, my breath caught. The painting seemed to hold me, and the woman's gaze intensified, as if she were trying to tell me something. The next morning, I decided to return the painting to the flea market, but when I arrived, the seller was gone. The stall was closed, and neighbors told me he had moved away days earlier. Since then, the painting has remained in my home, as if it refuses to leave. Every night, I feel her eyes on me, and no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to part with it. Story 8. The attic in my parents' house. When my parents bought an old house in the countryside, they were thrilled to renovate it and turn it into their dream home. It was a spacious house with a large yard, towering trees, and a beautiful view of the mountains. However, there was one part of the house everyone preferred to avoid: the attic. From the first day, the atmosphere up there felt strange, heavy, as if someone were watching us. The air was cold, even on the hottest summer days, and there was a faint smell of mold mixed with something else we couldn't quite identify. I didn't believe in ghost stories, so when my parents asked me to go up to the attic and help with the cleaning, I agreed. I climbed the stairs with a flashlight since the light up there didn't work well. As soon as I opened the attic door, a chill ran down my spine, and the silence felt absolute, suffocating. The space was filled with old furniture covered in yellowed sheets and cardboard boxes stacked up over the years. Something felt wrong, but I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the uncomfortable environment. I started sifting through the boxes, checking what could be thrown away or donated. But as I sorted through the items, I felt a presence, as if someone were watching me. I turned quickly, pointing the flashlight at the darkest corner of the attic, and saw a shadow, crouched as if hiding behind an old armchair. The light flickered, and the shadow disappeared. I tried convincing myself it was just a play of light and shadow, but my heart was racing. I continued going through the items, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Then I heard a whisper, soft and drawn out, calling my name. I froze. The whisper came from somewhere near the staircase. I turned around slowly, expecting to find something, but there was nothing there. The silence felt denser, and I had a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I decided it was time to get out. I was about to go down the stairs when something caught my attention. In the attic's corner, there was a box that looked newer than the others. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it, opening it to find an old photo album with portraits of people I had never seen before. As I flipped through the album, I found a picture that chilled me. It was a portrait of a woman with a piercing, intense stare, exactly like the shadow I had seen moments before. Without a second thought, I left the album and ran down the stairs, locking the door behind me. I told my parents, but they laughed, thinking I was imagining things. In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was as if the shadow was always with me, watching from the darkest corners of the house. Since then, I have never gone back up to the attic. And every time I walk down the hall and look at the door, I feel that something or someone is waiting for me inside, still watching, still waiting for me to return and open the box to uncover the secrets it holds. Story 9. The Mysterious Guest. During college, I worked as a night receptionist in an old hotel downtown. It was a historic building with long red carpeted corridors, crystal chandeliers, and furniture that looked like it was from another century. The nights were usually quiet, almost monotonous, and I would pass the time reading or doing crosswords to stay awake. However, there was one night when things took a strange turn. It was a cold winter night. Almost all the guests were in their rooms and the hotel was silent. Around 3 in the morning, a man entered through the front door. He wore a dark overcoat and an old hat that obscured part of his face. I found it odd that he hadn't made a reservation, but I asked if he needed a room for the night. He nodded without saying a word, simply sliding his ID across the counter. The name on the document was blurred as if it had been wet, but I could make out Mr. Mora. I decided not to ask any questions and handed him the key to room 303, one of the few available. When he went up, an unsettling feeling came over me. His presence was disturbing. Something in his gaze, barely visible under the hat, sent a chill down my spine. I went back to the reception trying to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the image of the man from my mind. A few minutes later, one of the cameras on the third-floor corridor flickered, and for a moment, I saw Mr. Mora standing in front of the room door, staring at it as if hesitating to enter. After a while, he disappeared from the screen. Everything seemed calm, so I relaxed and went back to my book. But about an hour later, I heard footsteps descending the stairs. It was the same man, now without his hat. He had a pale face, hollow eyes, and an expression almost devoid of life, but with a deep melancholy. He approached the counter and said something that still echoes in my mind: "I'm in the wrong place. They don't want me to stay here." I tried to understand what he meant, but he turned away without explanation, simply leaving the hotel and disappearing into the fog of the early morning. Perplexed, I checked the records the next day, but his room was listed as vacant. Curious, I decided to check room 303, wondering if he'd left anything behind. I took the keys and opened the door, feeling an inexplicable chill inside, the air heavy and thick. Everything seemed in place except for one thing. On the bed was an old, yellowed photograph. The image showed a man very similar to Mr. Mora, standing in front of the same hotel, only the picture looked like it had been taken decades ago. I brought the photo to the manager, who looked at me with a grave expression and muttered something about the hotel's history. According to him, many years ago, a man with the same name had stayed there, but he never left. He was found dead in room 303, under mysterious circumstances. Since then, both guests and staff reported seeing a strange man who roams the hallways on cold nights, searching for a place to stay, only to be driven away by something haunting him. I never saw him again, but on cold nights, I still feel the same chill when I pass by the third floor. It's as if he's still there, trying to find peace, but forever trapped within the hotel's corridors. Story 10. The Doll in the Closet. When my sister was young, she received a porcelain doll from our grandmother. It was one of those old dolls with a delicate face, large eyes, and a lace dress. I always found the doll strange, but my sister adored it. She kept it lovingly in a closet next to her bed, and every night before bed, she'd say goodnight to it. It was a silly ritual, but it made her happy, so our parents didn't mind. Over the years, my sister lost interest in the doll, and it ended up forgotten in the closet. During her teenage years, she moved abroad, and her room was left untouched, like a time capsule. I hadn't thought about the doll in years until my parents asked me to clean out the room and remove old items. Reluctantly, I agreed. That afternoon, I started emptying the closet, pulling out old clothes and toys until I found the doll at the back. It was dusty, the dress yellowed with time, but its glass eyes seemed to stare at me with an unsettling intensity. I felt a chill as I held it, but I laughed at myself, thinking it was just an old doll. I decided to put it back in the closet casually and continued organizing the rest. That night, I went to bed peacefully, but I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, as if someone was in the room with me. I looked around and everything seemed normal, so I tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard a soft sound like something dragging across the floor. My eyes opened again, and when I looked at the closet, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it, so this made me uneasy. I got up, went to the closet, and found the doll lying on the floor as if it had been pushed out. I placed it back inside and shut the door, trying to ignore the chill crawling up my spine. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. After a few minutes, I heard the noise again, only this time louder, like someone scratching the closet door. The sound was slow and drawn out, and every time I closed my eyes, it seemed to get closer. Fear took hold of me, and for some reason, my mind turned to the doll. Finally, I mustered the courage to approach the closet again. When I opened the door, I found the doll in the same place, but its face looked different. The once empty eyes now seemed filled with anger, a restrained fury. Trembling, I grabbed the doll and headed down the stairs, determined to get rid of it. On the way, I felt the doll grow heavier in my hands, as if it was resisting, as if it didn't want to go. That same night, I buried the doll in the backyard far from the house. But since then, I feel as if something still lingers watching me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the same scratching noise outside, as if the doll is trying to come back. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next terror.